I have always had the strong need of being places on time, especially when I'm not driving myself. My tension around taking public transportation borders on the neurotic. This day was no different.
The night before, I began packing the clothes I would need for my weekend, and I now found myself in the familiar position of pacing about aimlessly, gauging the best time to leave, and as in the past, arriving at the Amtrak station a full hour before it was necessary.
I sat by myself and tried not to imagine what lay ahead, because I cautioned myself reality had no bearing on my mental fabrications. But what I could not stave off were my memories.
She was golden and shadowed, animated and unreachable, playful and silent, open and absent. I took a snapshot of her wearing my bathrobe in an overstuffed study chair, her hair covering half of her face out of modesty. She was the picture of innocence on a mission. She once took me to a Lower East Side apartment of a woman she knew much older than she and told me she wanted to be just like her. It terrified me. She'd pass me notes in the hallway. I would miss the first half of my classes avidly reading her thoughts. She would sneak up silently behind me and happily disrupt my composure. She was always associated with some other girl, which brought no end of jealousy and frustration to me, at least as far as I was able to admit it. But she liked me, and I knew it. And I was going to see her again.
Although we were light years from that pivotal time. Getting a taxi at Penn Station is never difficult. They practically throw themselves at you.
The problem is getting a driver who won't take you to New Jersey and back, only to deposit you 5 blocks from your point of origin in Manhattan. I am never as clever as I think I am about walking in New York. So I huffed it several blocks uptown and several back.
By the time I got to my hotel, I was city gritty.
I showered for 2 minutes and spent the following 15 fixing my hair, trying to decide what to wear.
Tossing aside the ill-considered clothing, the plum-colored men's suit with the pale blue shirt, the camel hair jacket, cotton sweater, and Gap jeans, and settled on a long-sleeve collarless, ecru-colored jersey, brown jacket to match my eyes, and khakis.
With one last look in the mirror, I replaced an errant lock of graying hair in an otherwise handsome haircut, pocketed my room card, address to the restaurant, cigarettes and lighter, and I set out for my sole reason of being in the Big Apple. I've always known that when song lyrics repeat themselves in my head, it's not because I have a strong urge to hear that song, but rather
those words have personal meaning, which I somehow need to heed. Bob Dylan was stuck in a groove.
all the while I was alone, the past was close behind. I've seen a lot of women, but she never escaped my mind, and I just grew tangled up in blue.
I called our old school, which was more than happy to help reunite former classmates, got her phone number, and screwed up the courage to call.
Hi, I said. It's me.
Hi, she said with astonishment.
I'd like to see you.
Palms almost sweaty with anticipation, I mentally checked my body language and strode into history class as if I hadn't a care in the world.
I slipped into a desk and pretended to study my textbook, all the while palpably aware of her several desks away. I could only see her peripherally, but I knew her by heart.
Blonde hair to the shoulders, small mole on the left side of her lip, green sweater, white blouse, and a plaid skirt, our private school uniform, and a soft voice which belied everything.
It was my second year at the school and her first, but both our sophomore year. I can't place a finger on when I first was aware of her, but I was drawn to her diffidence, her smile, and something tragic within her.
She was from the tough streets of Detroit and vulnerable all at once. A quality which raised feelings in me that were impossible to ignore, but easy to deny.
In an effort to gain my attention, she called to me in whispered tones, which I pretended not to hear. I didn't lift my head to look up until she very unexpectedly and amusingly called me
Yodel!
The name had no meaning, but it was sweet, silly, and affectionate. I was delighted. She moved over next to me. That night, in my room, I saw she had indelibly penned the name into my textbook.
No matter how adept I was at walking on city pavement, I opted for the subway, which would afford me a view of New York at its most colorful. Between mothers pulling violently at their children and men stealthily leering at women, I tried to curb my own need to imagine our meeting after so many years. But there was something addictive about the exercise, and fantastic images floated in and out of my consciousness. I didn't like to admit it, but I was nervous. I came up from the subway on the wrong side of the avenue, which was momentarily disorienting, but I got my bearings and strode down the correct street. I saw her Before she saw me, standing under the dark green restaurant awning with gold script letters anyone would be hard-pressed to decipher.
She was still blonde, although it could have been bottle blonde, and very thin, dressed in a nondescript pantsuit.
She carried a black bag slung over her shoulder, which she held with her right hand. I saw the red nail polish on the other hand, which she held by her side. She was looking around unconcernedly and turned when she saw me approach me, but did not walk to meet me. I detected a smile that was more curiosity than pleasure, and although I did not feel perused, I did feel self-conscious.
I smiled what I hoped was brilliance and confidence, and when I was near enough, I said a hearty
Hi!
and put out my arms for a hug, which was brief, almost informal.
And into which I felt she put very little of herself.
As we separated
I scanned her simply made-up face
and saw there the intervening
and
years.
something else I could not detect. How are you?
I looked into her eyes and was astonished I'd forgotten they were totally blue. She still had that sexy mole on her lip. Of course, where would it go?
I began talking nervously, and she floated rather than walked next to me. Like she was going to make an impression on the pavement. I suddenly felt quite brutish, like I had disturbed a delicate vase.
We sat at an outdoor table.
I ordered a drink.
And she ordered a soft drink because I was informed.
She had wisely given up drinking many years ago. I lit my cigarette, and then hers.
In a manner that was, I reprimanded myself, most ungentlemanly.
My self-conscious teenage angst aside, there were some truly humiliating moments with her. I'd gotten some dreadful illness, the name of which I was not coherent enough to focus on, and out of school for a week. My doctor, who was also my father, had just administered to me a very painful shot in the behind.
And when I hobbled into the living room on the way to my bedroom, she was there, waiting to visit with me.
I promptly fainted at her feet.
I never doubted that she would avoid me, if only in the name of contagion, but visit she did, quite unexpectedly, the following summer.
In our house, if anyone knocked at the front door, we didn't know them. So when I opened it and she was standing there, I was speechless. What on earth earth is she doing here?
Surely not to see me after the mess I made of myself on the floor in this very room.
But she was, in fact, here to visit with me. I was oh so polite. I might as well have offered to serve her tea. The visit lasted less time than it takes to boil the water, and when she left, I was ashamed of myself for not being more familiar.
The waitress came with our drinks as we scanned the menu.
I felt her sneaking furtive looks at me, but of course I was doing the same.
Our eyes met, and we both smiled uncomfortably.
There were some aspects of her that had changed very little. Her taciturn moments and reserve, her face, which was largely unreadable, neither open nor closed, and her clear blue eyes.
She was also careworn.
As if a part of her spirit had been removed.
We talked over dinner, and I asked her about her life, and after a long silence and exhale, she replied,
Well, I have a son who's 18 and in college now, and my husband, and my job, if you can call it that.
She answered carefully, and I noticed cursorily, but I felt there was something more behind it. Could it be pride? I thought it interesting that she mentioned her son first.
and that she met her husband after college in Arizona.
And then moving back to Westchester where he had a trucking business.
And she worked in a library.
There were lots of painful miscarriages.
And her son was something of a miracle. Being much more at ease with conversation.
She did speak the moment, bare facts about her family, and only the most minimal without any embellishment. I then spoke more about my family and my life and my moments of travel and misadventures and my 6-year-old son from a relationship that had just ended of 16 years, and that I was a general contractor with a very successful business. Upon hearing this, she launched into conversation about her deck that had gone to rack and ruin.
I was reminded of my father, who had lamented to me that at cocktail parties, he inevitably was canvassed by someone looking for an informal diagnosis of the symptoms they were experiencing, and for which they spared no amount of detail. It was owing, of course, to his open and friendly manner, which I must have inherited.
This was the most animated she'd been all night. And I tore a page out of my father's book and finally said, "Look, why don't I just come stay at your house and we'll build this thing together?"
To which she sternly replied,
Oh, you're not staying at my house.
Which I took from her remark that I was not altogether an unwelcome guest. But we were now on common ground for the first time that evening. My flirtation with the waitress made her smile, and I felt her relaxing more. "Do you ever hear from anyone from school?" I asked, trying to keep the momentum going.
Not anymore.
She answered with such vehemence that I felt a draft of air from the door closing. I wondered what lay behind such an expression of finality.
Did something happen?
I don't carry on conversations all that well.
I think you're doing fine.
She shrugged, stubbed out her cigarette, and gazed at the passers-by.
I felt her discomfort, not so much with words, but with the unspoken feelings behind them.
But I decided to let it go, paid the bill over her objections, and we walked down the street, side by side, with no particular destination.
We came to a small park and sat down next to each other on a low wall facing opposite directions,
Like one of those Victorian chairs.
where people are together but not touching.
She looked at her watch.
A signal that time was bearing down on us but made no move to leave.
There was a group of people surrounding some drummers. Their incessant tattoo was infectious.
I tapped an echoing beat on my leg. And I watched her watching them, and I thought she was still quite beautiful.
We sat in silence for a time.
And after a while, she said, without looking at me and with some weight to her breath,
You know, I always wished something had happened between us.
If it hadn't been dark, she would have seen me blush. But I'm nothing if not honest, and I answered in kind.
me too. But I never knew that about you.
Oh, there's a lot you don't know about me, she said with a chuckle and a small sense of intrigue.
There's always been a lot I don't know about you.
My words felt weighty, as did my feelings.
I thought, but did not ask.
The million questions I had.
In the basement of her dorm, a group of girls were gathered in a serious ceremony of grief that only teenagers can muster.
Not feeling part of the inner sanctum, I stayed on the periphery and gleaned through piecemeal that
She had just gotten a letter from her mother telling her that finances were bad and she would have to work in addition to going to school.
she was in tears, and my inability to get close to her and comfort her tore my heart out. Also, I was nonplussed at her situation. We were all so well off, I thought, that this kind of thing didn't happen.
She took a job at a local gift shop.
I visited her there only once, with all possible good intentions and the hopefulness of a person living without enough water. If nothing else, it was an opportunity to see her without a cadre of other girls.
She was stocking products, still in her school uniform.
I gamely attempted a conversation, but she was reticent. I thought at the time that she just wasn't interested in me, or that I was being a nuisance. But in retrospect, I think
She was simply embarrassed by her position.
If I had known that, I never would have compromised her like that. I left soon after I arrived, as I always did, without any feeling of completion.
Come on, I said, hold her to her feet. Let's go. We headed uptown and miraculously ended up in front of my hotel.
no telling how that could have happened.
I don't know about going up there with you, she said with an indefinable look.
Just for a minute. I promise I won't do anything.
To her credit, she looked doubtful but intrigued.
As we stepped into the hotel, the elevator, and the corner room with a view of the kitchen exhaust system below.
Standard fare hotel room, I thought, as I let her in. Nothing to be embarrassed about. 2 beds, curtains that smelled of too many deodorizing chemicals, silly nothing pictures on the wall, and folded over toilet paper in the bathroom.
Which is where she went first. I glanced about the room. Do I sit on the bed?
Is that too gauche?
Do I sit on the only chair and make her sit on the bed?
Is that way too gauche?
So I stood there in my indecision. Jacket still on, hands in pockets, looking like I was waiting for the bus. She came out of the bathroom looking freshly put together, avoiding my eyes.
Okay to smoke in here?
I don't see why not. I'll open a window.
Anyone who stayed in a hotel in New York knows those damn windows don't open.
So I turned the air on instead, hoping she didn't think I thought it was a window.
She sat in the only chair.
Well, that settled that at least. I lit her cigarette, and then my own, and sat down opposite her.
Our knees almost touching as we shared an ashtray.
I'd found on the chest of drawers disguised as a drinking glass.
I could think of nothing to say, and neither could she. The silence was thick, and I was beginning to perspire.
So, what time's your train? I croaked out. So much for trying to sound casual.
Well, I could take the 11:20 or the 12:10.
I glanced at the clock. The room was beginning to turn blue with smoke.
I had a really nice time, I said needlessly.
Me too. So what are you doing tomorrow? Are you staying in the city or are you going back? She said while staring at the painting on the opposite wall.
I haven't decided yet. I might go downtown, I don't know. What about you?
I might call up my friend Shirley and see if she wants to go shopping.
I nodded. trying to think of something else to say. I don't know how many times my head went up and down. It could be I look like one of those bobbing dog heads people put in the back seat of their cars.
I was having uncomfortable feelings about her life in Westchester.
Unbidden and spontaneous images of her husband and son and middle-class housewife friends to go shopping with.
I needed to do something. Anything. So I got up, did a stretch, and tried straighten out that silly nothing little picture she was been staring at.
It looked like a castle on a canal with a gondola in Venice.
About as lost and out of place as I felt. It didn't budge. Now why would you screw that to the wall?
People steal all kinds of things in hotel rooms.
I looked at the picture, looked at her, and then looked back.
Would you steal that? And besides, they could have at least gotten it level.
I could hear myself sounding ridiculous. I glanced over to her and she was smiling at me remotely, her eyes twinkling. I decided we needed more air and moved to the AC unit.
It's a little cold in here.
She said with her arms folded across her front, anticipating me. Yeah, now that you mention it. I was hot and sweaty.
Well, she said, with the weighty finality that only the word well can have, I have to be going.
As she spoke, she stood up in front of me. I stepped in closer to give her a hug, and she stepped into it. And I stopped her with a kiss. She pulled back slightly.
Oh God, I don't know if this is a good idea. She said unconvincingly.
I looked around to see if anyone else was convinced. They weren't, so I kissed her again. This time she let it happen, experimentally. Then I kissed the side of her neck, and she put her arms around me. Her breathing changed, and she smelled great.
Oh, what am I doing? She said as a kind of query and sort of relent.
You don't have to do anything, I said, leading her over to the bed that didn't have my stuff all over it, unless you want to.
With one smooth movement, she pulled me down. I kissed her mouth, face, and neck,
while my hand cautiously slid under her blouse.
There was no audible complaint.
I found her breasts soft, warm, and they fit perfectly. I was dizzy with unexpressed desire. Don't move, I whispered in her ear and lay down on top of her, pressing against her.
I felt her hands on my back. She pulled my shirt out of my pants. Her nails grazed my skin and gave me goosebumps. I shivered and gently put my tongue into her mouth, searching out hers. She moaned and held me closer.
Articles of clothing, alternately hers and mine, made their way to the floor.
I kissed both her breasts, teasing her nipples with my tongue. I made my way down to her belly, knees, sides.
Tender kisses, sweet little nibbles.
She made an audible sound which I can only momentarily discern. I found her thighs.
She made another sound.
Was it oh or no? I looked up at her. Too much, I asked.
She closed her eyes.
I slid my head up toward her head on the pillow.
Okay.
I leaned in to kiss her again, and she put her hand over my mouth and drew back slightly to look at me.
Really?
She said, searching my eyes for the truth. They never lie, so I said yes. And she put her arms around me and buried her face in my neck.
She said something that sounded like more peas kettle oven.
Which I took to mean you're a sweet, gentle lover. Is it okay if I touch you?
She took a deep breath and contemplated the question. She was lying half on her side.
Reached down and drew a line along her hips, buttocks, and the back of her thighs, giving her what I felt she needed to make a decision.
She pressed against me. Her earthy scent filled the space between us. Her climax ebbed into a delicious calm.
Her eyes were closed, but she sensed me looking at her and opened them.
You broke your promise.
And you missed your train.
Walking across the campus of our all-girls school, she silently came up behind me and linked her arm through mine. I beamed inwardly and felt strong beside her.
If I had had the nerve, I would have put my arm around her waist, but I was 16, scared about who might see, and not a little uncertain about what was right and what was wrong.
When she asked me where I was going, my answer came out hoarsely because my heart was in my throat. But where I was going wasn't anywhere I wanted to be. I was walking home. I lived off campus and she lived on campus, and I was dying to share that part of her life because it would have been being nearer to her in almost every possible way.
So, when are you gonna invite me over your house?
She asked, almost stunning me. First, because she wanted to be invited, and second, because dunce that I am, I didn't even think about it. You want to come this weekend?
Yeah.
She said, giving my arm a press and walking away toward the dorms. I drifted home dreamily amid confusing emotions, excitement, trepidation, confusion, and expectation.
Saturday came.
We hung out, talked, listened to Simon and Garfunkel records, took walks, smoked too many cigarettes, and ate in town. I was deliriously happy.
And I was petrified because I wanted so much to touch her,
To kiss her.
to breathe her into me.
When it came time to go to sleep, I loaned her a t-shirt and we got into my single bed.
I felt her warm body next to mine.
And I froze. I didn't know what was welcome
What was unwelcome, and I didn't want to presume.
or blow my friendship with her, or more to the point,
Appear foolish.
more fool me because I let slip by what might have been one of my greatest informative moments. I lay there rigid. I did not know her, but more importantly, I did not know myself.
You have to go to the bathroom.
I do.
Yes, because I have to call my husband and I can't do it with you in the room. It's an odd phenomenon that no matter how sexually intimate we are with one another, no matter how vulnerable we are, we still don't want to be seen walking around the room naked in front of each other.
She picked up my shirt from the heap on the floor and put it on before getting up. I grabbed the first thing from the other bed.
Relegated now to the bathroom, I wondered how long I'd be sequestered here. I looked at myself in the mirror,
Not bad for 49.
turning my head this way and that,
Here's a little messy.
but not because of my age. I could hear the muffled sounds of her conversation and decided I didn't want to, so I turned the bathroom fan on maximum time and waited.
The summer after graduation, she had asked me to stay with her.
At her aunt and uncle's house on Fire Island.
I took the ferry, and she met me at the dock looking tanned and lovely.
The girl from Ipanema.
The room we were to share was set apart from the rest of the house. It was cozy, with pale blue light filtering through a skylight onto 2 bunk beds. I changed into my suit, and we walked to the beach along the sandy and splintered boardwalk with huge growths of poison ivy on either side.
Our towels side by side on the beach.
I could not take my eyes off of her, the sun pouring down on a completely sexy black bikini, revealing her golden and glistening cleavage to its best advantage. I felt slightly voyeuristic staring at her like this because she did not see me watching her. We walked along the shore, swam in the surf, and talked about I know not what until the sun went down. And still, I felt that I did not really know her.
There was a minute tap on the door, and ridiculously, I said,
Come in.
instead of just opening it.
Hi.
She peered her head in.
She said with a smile in her eyes.
Hi, I said expectantly.
You need to be out here now.
I moved past her into the room, and she went into the bathroom and closed the door. When, I wondered, would we ever be in the same room again? I heard the toilet flush, and then the water running. After a while, it stopped. Silence and more silence. I decided to knock.
Who is it?
Room service, ma'am.
In the bathroom?
We don't specify which room, ma'am.
Well, I guess you better come in then. She was lazing happily in a bath with water up to her neck.
Which somehow made her seem curvier.
She felt a little exposed and tried to cover herself unsuccessfully.
Standard tubs are not made with two in mind, so I told myself if this were ever to happen again, I would get a room with a jacuzzi. Still, I stepped in, straddled her, both my legs beside her hips, my butt on her thighs, put my hand on her belly, and looked directly into her eyes. Did I ever make you cry?
Yes?
How many times?
Oh, about 6?
Good or bad tears?
Bad.
I leaned over and kissed each one of her eyelids, her cheekbones, her nose, and then her mouth, and counting out one for each cry.
Is that supposed to make it better?
I hope.
I don't think about that anymore.
I do.
It's in the past.
Sometimes the past is still in the present. She considered this, but said nothing. There were good tears?
Some.
Like what?
I remember being in your room and you played a Gordon Lightfoot song for me. It made me cry. It was so beautiful.
I remember. That was the name of it. I thought you were beautiful and I didn't know how to say it.
And you wrote me a song and played it for me on your guitar.
I was so nervous. I thought you'd hate it.
Anyway, those were good tears.
Not a good track record. 6 bad. 2 good. I'm sorry.
I truly regretted my actions and inactions those many years ago. We went to different colleges, both small, private women's institutions, but mine was in New Jersey and hers was in Boston. I was a hellion in college. With nothing to rein me in, I partied until there were no more parties, and then I started my own in an attempt to get as far away from myself as possible.
I was elected dorm president. I joined a sorority. I had a radio show. I hung out with the townies and in the theater department. Occasionally went to classes and developed latent crushes on other women, none of whom were she. One night, when I was actually in my dorm, I got a phone call.
She was calling from Boston.
I could hear the distress in her voice. She needed me. In hearing from her again, I was flattered, but also scared. I had done a good job of burying the thought of not having her and missing her terribly.
I couldn't go there. Wasn't ready or mature enough to finally pick up the ball and run with it. I cut her off, and I'd rather I'd cut out my own tongue.
As I walked away from the phone, I was filled with a horrible emptiness and a desperate sadness that has never left me. I never heard from her again.
The smelly curtains did a terrible job of keeping out the morning light. A stream of it hit my eyes. I opened them and closed them again.
I could hear the street traffic below. There's no feel or sound like the streets of New York. It has a rhythm and tenor all its own, and I found it comforting. I usually like a lot of space in my bed, but she was curled up against me like a perfect puzzle piece. I felt her stir.
It's morning.
I said thickly,
I don't want it to be.
Nonetheless, it was still morning, and I didn't like what that meant either. With my arm cradling her neck, I stroked her hair gently. She slid her hand across my stomach and draped her arm across me.
I need a smoke.
She said into my skin. I kissed the top of her head.
Reached out, lay on top of her.
And felt her mouth against my belly.
It was all at once meaningful, playful, and innocent.
A tremor
A tremor
ran
ran through me.
She was full of more surprises than anyone I had ever known. I wanted to say it.
I wanted the words to escape my lips.
To look deeply into her eyes and with all the feeling there was inside of me, finally say,
I love you.
My mouth moved in preparation and 3 words came out.
Oh my God!
The idea of staying in the city without her was anathema.
So, I packed up, checked out, and we shared a taxi to Penn Station. Sitting in the seat of the taxi, I wanted to make love to her all over again.
But I was certain that the driver wouldn't approve.
Or worse, he would want to join in.
So instead, we held hands like 2 schoolgirls, silently sliding our fingers together and looking out our respective windows.
At the station, we were taking separate trains.
Hers was leaving sooner, too soon. We stood in the middle of the platform looking into each other's eyes with people walking by, bumping into us and hurrying along. They might just as well have not been there.
Thanks, she said sweetly.
Anytime you need room service, you know who to call.
She smiled and her eyes looked bluer.
We embraced with all the power we could summon. And she stepped away.
I held her hand lightly and held on as long as my arm could reach. I watched her as long as I could, hips sway, wondering if she would turn to look back.
As I was turning away, I thought I saw her from the corner of my eye looking back at me.
But when I turned, she was gone, lost in the crush of travelers who were no doubt going home
To the ones they loved.